Hello and welcome to this final day of the annual conference, and I hope you found some really interesting sessions. I'm told that we have over almost 2,000 delegates from 57 countries, which is really fantastic. For me personally, one of the key highlights was the Kevin Fong keynote speech yesterday, which I found inspiring, fascinating, but also incredibly humbling. Now, over the course of this week, we've had a number of sessions on ESG and of their growing importance to treasurers, both from an investment and a lender's perspective. Now, many of these organizations rely on the assessment of a credit rating agency to help them understand and assess what is going to call on, or what I'm going to call the ESG-ness of these companies. Now, given the importance attached to these calls, it's really important to understand how the rating agencies come to their conclusions. And during the next 40 minutes, I hope to shed a bit of light into this complex but nonetheless critical area and to dispel or confirm some of the concerns and suspicions treasurers have. Now, luckily for you, you don't have to take my word on it, as we're joined by a really good team from S&P Global Ratings with over 25 years experience in corporate analysis, ratings, and ESG. Now, before we get going, the obligatory bit of housekeeping, audience Q&A, really always really useful and makes this much more fun for myself and for the panelists. Please keep them specific, but actually do keep them broad as well. A reminder, the session's being recorded. It should be available at the end of today for up to 30 days. And do continue to get engaged with the ACT on social media. We've got lots of active LinkedIn groups. You can follow us on Twitter at ACT Update and tweet using the hashtag ACTAC21. Now, before we start, let me make some introductions. My name's Naresh Agrawal. And if you didn't know before, I've got over 30 years working in Treasury, and I now provide policy and technical support here at the ACT. Joining us, I'm delighted to welcome Beth Burks, who's the Director of Sustainable Finance, and as well as being the lead analyst for EMEA, covering all sustainable finance evaluation, she's one of the regular delegates at the Conference of Parties, which this year is being held in Glasgow, and I guess Beth is really excited about going there. Pierre Georges is a Senior Director and the Global Coordinator for ESG Outreach, and joins us from, I think, sunny Paris. I'm not sure if he's heading to Glasgow, but we'll find out during the next 40 minutes if he is. Now, normally, I try and create a conversation so it doesn't feel like an interview with two different people. But Pierre and Beth have insisted that we have two separate interviews. And before we get going, Pierre, can you tell me why you thought this is really important?
Thanks, and hello, everyone. Yeah, this is important for two things. I think the first thing is that Beth is a super spokesperson, and I didn't want to feel too disadvantaged during that conversation, so it was better to split this call. The second reason is, by definition, just an excuse. But more seriously, I think we have put a pretty catchy title for this session today. We're talking about black box, and rating agency and black box usually are words we don't want to see together in the same title. So obviously now we need to come up with something. And I think that the point is that we didn't want to increase the level of confusion that already exists in the ESG market. And when we talk about ESG, in the end, we're just talking about something that comes into an analysis, and it's all about the scope of that analysis. And at S&P, for some years now, we have come to the conclusion that we should have two directions in how to look at things on ESG. And the first one is how ESG factors effectively materially influence our credit analysis and credit ratings. And this is what we call on our side ESG in credit. And this is the part that I will be covering. And on the other end, we have a broader sustainability assessment independent from credit ratings, which is a deeper dive into an entity's exposure and management of ESG factors, and considering all of the implications and impacts on environment, on society, and broader stakeholders. So on top of that, thinking about how we try also to assess how a company is getting prepared and is resilient to those emerging risks. And that is what is embedded into our other service, which is ESG Evaluation, which Beth will be presenting.
Okay, super. So, well, you convinced me. Hopefully, you convinced the audience as well. So, let me start my first question to you. As a credit rating agency, how have you tackled ESG into your analysis so far?
Yeah, I think we tackled it together with how the market is effectively tackling this. So we came up with two trends that emerged over the recent years. The first one is that the materiality and the relevance of these factors into the credit analysis have increased. And I'll explain that in a minute. The second element is that there is an increasing demand for transparency and disclosure. So we try to combine the two and ultimately come up with something that makes sense for the market. And so going back to the first point, so materiality and relevance into the credit ratings. I think the market has clearly switched gears when it comes to ESG over the recent years, and particularly since the beginning of the pandemic. That was a material change for several reasons. The first one is that health and safety issues suddenly became a major concern for investors. Second one is the political response that came from this crisis, and ultimately coming to the energy transition as being one of the key pillars of the economic recovery as part of this pandemic. I think that is very important, because suddenly energy transition becomes much more critical and much more material to many sectors and to the overall economy. So that's the second thing, health and safety, and then energy transition. And the third element is also the fact that the E, S, and G factors are more taken into consideration by the investors and by the market in general terms. And that is also very important, because suddenly the way the analysis is done by investors changes, and that also influences how a company can effectively access the market. And another last point I would say is that we also see increasingly or more frequent physical risk linked to extreme weather and ultimately linked to climate change. And those have materialized in recent years quite dramatically. You can think about what happened in California, what happened in Texas in particular, with clear and direct credit implications. So all in, we believe that the materiality of the ESG risks on credit quality has significantly increased and need to be reflected in our credit ratings. So that's one angle. Now, talking about transparency and disclosure, I think, as I said, there is a high demand for more transparency, more disclosure on how ESG factors effectively influence the rating. And we are also working on that part. So since last year, we have introduced qualitative assessment of how these factors effectively influence the rating. And since the beginning of the year, we have accelerated massively our efforts into that. Notably through three elements. First one is, at the beginning of the year, we have revised our industry risk scores, better reflecting the ESG factors, health and safety I was mentioning, energy transition on the other end. I think those elements are better reflected into our views of industry risk. The most visible part of that was the change of industry risk score for oil and gas sector. So that's something where we do see more materiality, and it's effectively embedded into our analysis. The second element it was our announcement that we will introduce alpha numerical scores or credit indicators on E, S, and G. So that will be done by September, and it will help analysts to really factor all these, to better reflect all these E, S, and G factor have an influence on the rating. So it's a scale from 1 to 5 that we will define as we get closer to the September date. And the third development that we've done is on is a request for comment on our corporate methodology just to better reflect and embrace all of those ESG factors into our corporate methodology. It's not a change in methodology, it's just a better reflection of those factors into that methodology.
And you talked at the beginning, Pierre, about the black box, and clearly part of what we want to do today is just open up a bit more around that black box. Are you saying that if people out listening today want to look at some of this information, it is already available on your website or I don't know, wherever?
Everything is indeed available on our website, publicly available. I think that's also very important. Our methodology is not only for subscribers, it's available for everyone. Our research on ESG is also publicly available. So we really try to have as much transparency as possible, both on the methodology and the research, because we know those are very important developments and work in progress in many aspects when it comes to the regulation, when it comes to the standardization. And obviously we want to be part of that and very transparent on those topics. I'm
just going to check again. So even if people aren't subscribers or paying for S&P Global Ratings services, they should still be able to get quite a lot of information about your methodology.
Not quite a lot, all the information.
Okay. I'll stand correct. That's brilliant. That's great. Okay, so so one of the things that I've heard certainly 2 or 3 years ago is a number of treasurers complaining about unsolicited ratings, where I'm not saying you and Beth, but folks like yourselves have gone through annual reports, have gleaned information, and have used that to come away with, often, certainly from the treasurers I spoke to, a very poor and biased view of their ESG-ness, as I'm going to call it again. What's your view on that today?
I was trying to comment on the ESG credit ratings, and for that part, I will let Beth also comment on ESG evaluation and the importance of the interaction with issuers. But when it comes to ESG credit ratings, as I said, I mean, it's just one output of our existing methodology. And for the credit side, I mean, credit ratings, we don't do unsolicited ratings. So everything needs to be accompanied with an interaction with the issuer. This is how we work. And the ESG credit indicators I was mentioning is really part of that rating. And the fact that we effectively announced that we will introduce those credit indicators as early as April for an implementation in September is notably because we want to make sure we have time to discuss with issuers, explain where we're coming from, for them to have an opportunity to respond to our objections eventually, and ultimately have that interaction and before we go to any publication. So that interaction is clearly part of our core business, and therefore the unsolicited part is clearly not in scope. Yeah.
And again, just, I mean, I've not issued a lot of debt in my time, but I have engaged with rating agencies, and just reflecting on some of those conversations, some of them have been quite harsh, that they said this is our methodology, and some of it was a time before methodologies were published as they are now. Is what I'm hearing then part of it that because this is still an emerging area, that legitimately corporates and treasurers can have quite punchy conversations with folks like yourselves and not feel that it's basically just a one-way conversation?
I think, I mean, one of my credo is we need to be very humble on ESG. I think it's work in progress in many aspects. First, the disclosure, as we know, is not perfect, unlike for financial metrics. The regulation is evolving very fast. As I was alluding to, when it comes to energy transition, the policies also move very fast. So it's all progressing, and we need to work hand in hand with issuers in that domain to understand how they tackle this fast changing operating scope, and obviously how we can address that into our ratings. So it's definitely an interaction rather than a monologue on our side. And that's very important that we have this dialogue and that we learn from each other. I think, yeah, ultimately, maybe just to this is what I try to convey, but these credit indicators, it's just another degree of disclosure and transparency and not a change in the ratings. This is not the intent. We don't want to suddenly overweigh on ESG. We just want to make sure we reflect how these factors have been considered into our analysis.
So I'm not sure you can answer this question, but it's all very well you being very robust about your ESG analysis. But what's your sense around how the financial markets who read your reports and make decisions about how engaged they are, how competent they are? Because I must confess, I still hear a variety of views by treasurers about what they think of the sort of lending and investment community.
Yeah, I mean that's the topic I was mentioning. I was mentioning scope at the beginning of this conversation and the perimeter that you're looking at. And of course, depending on the definition you give to the E, S, and G factors, depending on the scope you're looking at, I think you can have a variety of analysis and a variety of views on ESG. So ultimately, the important part and what we are really trying to do is to make those first the methodology being open to the public. Second, have clear definitions on what we're looking at. And third, having sufficient benchmark when it comes to how we analyze things. And I believe this is also the strength of what we do as a rating agency, is to provide that benchmark, provide that comparability that ultimately clarifies where we're coming from and how we view things. And we know it's an emerging theme. So by definition, there would be a lot of education on how we look at things, but ultimately we want to, I mean, as we've done for all our developments into credit ratings, we want to make sure that there is this consistency, that there is this comparability, and ultimately the right methodology that supports that. So that is really part of what we're doing. So a lot of education, a lot of interaction, just like we do today, to make sure that we are all on the same page.
Okay. And one of the things that I'm sort of mindful of at times, some of the claims that companies can make around the sort of I'm going to use that wrong word again, their ESG-ness. How do you deal with that, given that some of the data is really very judgmental?
Yeah, I think that's typically the kind of issue that we face, and there are the future claims and there are the past claims as well. And I think we need to understand. So it's not because you paid for past claims that you're better off tomorrow, because the next time it actually may be exponential in terms of future claims. So it's also something to look at, and how you dealt with your past claims, and what could happen in the future, or how that could be an impact. But let's talk about future claims. I think we want, into the rating, we want to incorporate what is material for the issuer's creditworthiness. And by material, it involves, I mean, the notion of probability, of course, and ultimately impact, which would be the amount in the case of claims. But when we have less predictable long-term risks, I guess this is what those claims are about, we still want to capture them. We want to capture them in a more qualitative manner most of the time, unless we have sufficient comfort that they will materialize. And notably when downside could be severe and risk mitigants are likely but still very uncertain, that's where we also want to flag that into the rating. And that could be through, if we go through the methodology, on comparative rating modifier, so a notch to reflect this additional risk compared to a peer. But yeah, it will be difficult to see it otherwise. So that said, again, I think the credit indicators, the ESG credit indicators that we aim to introduce, we also tackle these topics to better flag them and make it maybe clearer for investors how we effectively address these issues.
Okay. Super. That's been really helpful. I'm going to turn now to Beth. So one of the things that I've somebody showed me, I think a couple of years ago, Beth, was a correlation map showing how sort of in my younger days how the major rating agencies came to very similar conclusions about large organizations, large companies. But it was looking at the sort of ESG ratings specifically around the same organizations and coming out with really wildly different viewpoints. Where are we on that? Is that still true? Was it true then? What's your thoughts on that?
Sure. So yeah, that paper came out a couple of years ago, round about the time that we launched our ESG evaluation, which is what we call the ESG scores or the ESG rating that we provide at S&P Ratings. And really, it all came down to two simple things. So methodology and materiality. So from the methodology perspective, there wasn't a convergence, and I think this is still mostly the case on what the issues are in ESG and what we should be measuring as part of ESG. And I think there's been some recent developments that seem to be hopeful in terms of the market is trying to standardize across different accounting frameworks, different KPIs to look at and the like. So we might start to see some improvement in terms of the methodology there. And also, there's just a very simple part of the methodology that was really driving a lot of the rating lack of correlation. So it was really to do with scale. So some of them were looking at ESG performance on a global scale, and some were just looking at who's the best in that sector. And clearly, if you're taking those kind of approaches, you're going to come up with very different outcomes for some of the companies more at the sort of, I guess, probably the riskier end of the scale in terms of their overall environmental and social exposure. So you can think the oil and gas sector, for example, as well as at the top end, you're going to just come out with different outcomes. And the final thing, really on the materiality side, so is what weight do you give to all of these issues? I mean, ESG is incredibly broad. You're looking at, all of the various ways you can interact as an entity that's, accessing the capital markets, all the ways you can interact with the environment, and all the ways you can interact with society. And that's a very complicated, complex world that we're operating in and trying to opine on. So determining, to boil it down to maybe a simple example. So I cover Unilever as part of my portfolio of companies. As an analyst, do I give more weight to the environmental issue of plastic pollution or palm oil? And so, you're going to have to sort of come up with a determination of these issues and what weights you should apply to the various aspects that you're looking to score Unilever's performance on. And that can drive some of the differences between scoring providers is kind of where they stand on what those weights should be. And so for the ESG evaluation, I mean, what we tried to do was we really tried to simplify the number of scores that we're providing, the number of factors that we're looking at. We apply a global scale, which I think, helps investors see our overall opinion of that industry risk that they really value from within the credit rating. We've borrowed that for the ESG evaluation. And really, we're only looking at 11 factors across the S and G, which isn't a huge number of issues to score on, but within that, they're broad enough that they allow us to sort of capture some of the nuances. I mean, Pierre said already, ESG is evolving. It evolves, and the issues that come up, both, data privacy was a huge issue a number of years ago, and GDPR regulation started to sort of level that one out for lease companies in Europe. But then there's new issues that crop up all the time. So we wanted to sort of, I guess, apply a little bit of scientific thinking, the simplest approach that covers the most. And so we've really simplified down the number of factors that we score companies on. And on the weight side, well, we put out a request for feedback from the market. So we have all of those documents on what our weights are for the various sectors. We'll be releasing all sectors by the end of this month. So we're looking really for market feedback on that, so that we can start to really standardize the way we view, what issues are the more important ones for which sectors. And yeah, so I think, we're starting to hopefully see a bit more stability in the scores and the methodologies that are taken. But it's going to be more to come, and the next few years are pretty critical for that.
One of the things that I'm going to pick up on, you mentioned about feedback. How are you getting that feedback? And if there are organizations which haven't heard from you, but want to get involved, is that possible? And how would they do that?
Sure, yeah. So on our website, we have what we call the key sustainability factors. So these are documents which look at the material issues that we consider for a specific sector, for consumer goods, for example, as well as the weights that we're assigning to those factors. And then at the end of that, there's probably an email addresses, phone numbers, and ways of getting in contact with us to provide your feedback. And I think, we really do value not only the feedback from investors, but also from treasury departments, because of what Pierre said. With ESG, we have to take a bit of humility here, right? Everyone's trying to figure out the best way forward, and we all know that there are certain critical issues that that need to be solved on a very accelerated, rapid time frame. So there's some pressing, societal concerns that we're looking to try and address with this. So I think, hearing from treasurers, hearing from their sustainability reporting departments as well, all of that is incredibly valuable feedback for us as we continue to kind of move forward in this space and try and get, approaches that are really fit for purpose.
So I guess what I'm hearing is we shouldn't sit on the sidelines whinging about how you folks have come up with your methodology.
No, please don't. Whinge at us.
But at least you provide us with a channel to share what we think. That's really good, because I think, as you say, we have to. I'm very mindful that as my 16-year-old daughter and my 19-year-old son constantly remind me, this is not a perfect science. This is about trying hard and doing what we fundamentally believe is the right thing for all people on this planet, and recognizing that we're going to get some of it wrong as well. So there's a call out to people listening. Don't just sit on the side. Give Beth and Pierre and their teams a hard time if you don't like what they're suggesting. Cool. So one of the things that I think is really complicated, certainly around supply chain, are things like human rights. And we obviously, I guess most of us feel very, this is a critical thing. We shouldn't ignore it. But I still have conversations with treasury folk in the UK saying, no, I know all of my people, they're all, we have proper contracts and they're paid a decent wage. And so this has got nothing to do with me. How do you assess what could be pretty long supply chains?
Yeah, I think it's one of the issues that is fairly challenging to look at. I mean, we've kind of come up the maturity curve collectively as market participants on the carbon side, and we know how challenging it is to even trace what the emissions are and be able to kind of start to put in place the right mitigation for that on the carbon side. And I think, with human rights, that maturity also needs to come to the forefront. I mean, I think where traceability is possible, that's fantastic. That is clearly the first step. And I think there's also, a bit of understanding about what are the investigative reporters saying around human rights? Where are these things coming up? And getting a bit more of an understanding from from the broader picture of where these abuses are occurring, and then starting to peel that back and figuring out, is that potentially in my supply chain? And I think, some of them are a little bit more straightforward. We know for a long time there's been supply chain initiatives around the mining sector, for instance. Those things are fairly mature, but new places and investigations crop up. So last year the news were all about Xinjiang region, right, and the suffering of the Uyghurs there. So companies are really having to start to understand and trace when these issues occur. But having a general sense of your supply chain up the tiers is important, especially for some of the more, I guess, at-risk commodities, including agricultural commodities. And then it's all about setting risk tolerances, about what your organization is willing to accept and willing to not accept, and ensuring that you're prepared for if something crops up, that you know exactly what your position will be on that, and be guided by that preparation. So it's definitely something that we look at and consider, and discussions with companies, we want to know when these things come up that they understand what their exposure is to that particular issue, and also what their position is ultimately on that issue, knowing that sometimes, caveating that sometimes human rights, they're clearly fundamental to, and we've all signed up for them. So I think it's one of those issues where it's still it's grounded on that traceability element.
Yeah, and actually, listening to that, although I'm a vegetarian, one of the things I came across was M&S on their supply packaging for fish products.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a code or barcode or a QR code that allows you to see where that particular fish has actually come from, whether it's sustainable or not. I have no idea how what technology goes to sit behind all of that. Mm-hmm. But I was quite impressed that they actually put themselves, I don't know also if it's true or not, but it's, I thought it was really good for M&S to put it out there that they were at least trying to, share some of this information. So
yeah, certainly. I mean, we do see sort of in this space, blockchain technology being deployed for continuing of traceability of physical goods and so on. But yeah, it's something that I, having spoken to a number of companies about this and their own supply chain issues, I have a lot of sympathy, because there is still, you can send an auditor out, but it's very difficult to really know if those practices are always being done, even when there's no audits there. So this whole piece is really about just enforcement of law, really, and so yeah, it's something that is quite tricky, but ultimately, I mean, what we're looking for is just an understanding of how far and how mature is your traceability programs, and what are you able to do to try and ensure that you have compliance across that supply chain piece.
So going back to some of the myths, whether they're true or not, do you come across companies that are sort of shopping around? So with if, for example, somebody may not like your weighting around plastics, and have done a lot of work on it, maybe they want to get it to rating from another agency that does value what they do more highly than you. Is this something which you're aware of that people are doing?
So we've been going for about 2 years now, so we're still relatively a newer space. I think what's interesting, I mean, this kind of goes back to our approach around solicited versus unsolicited. So in the ESG space, we always have that solicited model ourselves. We borrow that from credit rating, and that's, as you mentioned at the start of your talk, isn't true of all of the scoring out there. So it's possible, but I think we wouldn't change that solicited model. We think it's really important to have that engagement with the companies that we're evaluating. So for example, there's many ways to achieve net zero. You can purchase RECs, you can have on-site renewable generation, PPAs, all these various different options. Those aren't in the accounting standards or reporting requirements now today. So we want to really understand the decarbonisation strategy that a company is putting in place, and through that we need that level of interaction. And within, I guess, the topic of net zero, we've already seen some companies and individuals getting into hot water by making claims that then they've had to backtrack. So, we want to make sure that we're ensuring that the claims that companies are making in their reportings, we understand them fully, and we do that through our interaction. I mean, we know the maturity of ESG data isn't quite there yet, that we can get everything from disclosure alone. So we do want to have that interaction, and I think it's also very beneficial for companies as well, because if you have a big ESG event, you may put in place like new risk management protocols following that event, and we want to hear from you, the ones that we cover, to understand exactly what you've been doing to address that, to see how material that could be going forward, because we always want our pieces to be forward-looking in nature, so that we're giving the right opinions for investors that they're really after, and they're after forward-looking ESG analysis. So yeah, I mean, rating shopping by issues, like you said, we'll go back to the key sustainability factors on our website. Let us know. We're here to understand exactly what the market wants.
If I may add, Beth, I think it's also ultimately the end game for us is to be the same as for credit ratings. Is to be I mean, you go to the rating agency, but obviously, given the transparency of the methodology, you should know where you end. Where you go to before you get assigned the rating. I think this is where what we want to achieve, and that comes with transparency, that comes with a clear methodology, and ultimately the analysis can be done elsewhere before being validated by S&P. So I guess when it comes to rating shopping again, ultimately, I mean, the more disclosure you bring to the market, the more trust there is from the investors and from the financial community, more generally speaking. I mean, the better it will be for everyone, because you know where you end to, and yeah, I guess that's how you can avoid that notion of rating shopping. Really.
And I'm going to pick here on one of your words around trust, and it reminds me of an interview I did, I think, a couple of years ago with Tom Bolton, who leads the Treasury and Corporate Finance team at Thames Water. And he said a lot of what they did, it was really set by tone from the top, that it's not the financing, it's not a particular silo of activity. It's to what extent can they convince other people that this is a systematic and systemic through the organization, this embrace of ESG, to greater or lesser extent, but at least it's sitting there and it's being reinforced. And I guess that's part of what you look for when you look at the trust. It's not just for the Treasury team.
I don't know, Beth, if you want to comment, or should I? No, I guess, yeah. I guess it should transpire throughout all the organization, ultimately, how these ESG topics are tackled. And this is why we go from what the company discloses to how we compare that to peers, how we see that from the other market stakeholders, because that's also the work we do, and ultimately up to the board level, to understand how everyone is effectively embracing those topics, and effectively, can you really believe, do you have a credible plan actually to achieve those targets? And I guess this is also the value add that we have through those interactions and through the different interviews and analysis that we do. So ultimately, we want to make sure that everyone is is effectively in the loop and to make it happen, and that you have milestones as well. This notion of milestone is becoming increasingly important, because you get to these net zero targets, talking about energy transition to 2050 now, 2035 in some other markets, but ultimately, if you don't have the milestones very clearly defined to get there, I mean, yeah, you may lack some credibility to get the credentials for that ambitious target. So, and that's, I believe, what the market is looking at more and more. I mean, when you look at how the sustainability-linked bonds or loans are structured, it's actually embedding some milestones into the covenants here to effectively prove that you are doing the right things in a relatively short time frame, rather than just that ambitions. And I guess this is also what we're looking at.
Okay, we've got some questions from the audience. Question one is, with E, S, and G, you weight them equally?
Sure. So yeah, in our methodology, we have a slight overweight for governance. So that's at 40% and 30% for E and S. And the reason really being that we expect companies to have strong governance protocols in place in order to manage their E and S risks as well. So I think really what we're looking for is proper, thorough risk oversight of those two as well. So we have a slight overweight for governance in overall in our analysis. Yeah. And I think really going beyond that, like part of our analysis is called preparedness, and actually that has a very material weight. And that's our forward-looking piece where we have sat down with a board member and usually top management as well, and discussed the future strategy and the direction of the company. So that really can have a significant impact on the final score. So it doesn't neatly form into E, S, and G, because we are looking at any potentially disruptive trend that could impact your business model and strategy. So including technological, climate change, skill shortage, whatever it may be. So that overall has the biggest impact, can have a significant impact at the top ends of the scales.
Maybe to avoid confusion when it comes to credit ratings, I mean, it's not, I mean, we don't weigh actually E, S, and G. We just take what is material. So E could be material, S less so. And so that will really depend on the sector you're in and what really matters for your own company.
Super. Next question is, you penalize companies that have over-ambitious targets.
Yeah, so in the ESG evaluation, again, like that preparedness piece is about our view of how credible the future strategy is and how resilient it will be. So yeah, we are sitting down within each factor, different targets. We're looking to see that companies have plans in place to meet those. And so it's something that we would consider if we do feel that these claims are potentially not going to be met, and it's something that we take into account. Yeah, for sure. Okay,
and the final question from the audience, and I've got a couple of mine, which hopefully you can indulge me with. What type of spread is there like between an issue with no ESG score and one with a high score?
Yeah, you want to take that one?
I can take it. Yeah, I think ultimately so that's the interesting part when it comes to how the market is evolving. I think there was no spread when looking at the green debt versus normal debt 2 years ago. I think it was just people were kind of learning about how this could work, what it means. I mean, suspicion of greenwashing. I think the market is evolving, and the targets are becoming, I mean, the green features are becoming clearer in terms of standardization. The sustainability-linked debt type of structure also helps to better understand where the company is going. And we see, of course, an increasing appetite for ESG type of instruments. So the spread starts to be seen. Of course, it's not automatic, but we start to see some spread, and notably because there is an increase, the oversubscription for debt into those markets is also higher for now than a standard bond. I think for us, it's also a question of accessibility to the market and length of the debt that you can get. And this is increasingly interesting in terms of credit development. In some sectors, we'll certainly have much less access to capital markets going forward because of exclusion policies, because they are not showing the right ESG credentials. And I think we're really trying to make a significant differentiation among those players, because obviously that will have a direct impact on their liquidity and capital structure. The other element is the length, as I said, of the debt you could obtain, depending on the sector you're in. If you're a sector which is on a secular decline because of the ESG issues, of course, you will also have access to much shorter debt maturities, with also a direct impact on credit ratings. And ultimately, the spreads will also be different. So I believe the question was more on whether you need to have that rating or not as well. Everything comes together. I mean, the more you engage on ESG, the more you need also some third-party opinions, and ultimately show that it's not only your own commitment and your own judgment of how you do, but rather a third party assessing whether you are going in the right direction.
Okay, super. We've run out of time, unfortunately. I think we could go on for a lot longer. But just a reminder, later today we have Sarah Breeden, who's an Executive Director at the Bank of England, talking to my colleague James Winterton about the climate change agenda. Reminder, you can watch this session again on demand. I think it should be available at the end of today and for 30 days. Do go and look at the virtual exhibition. There's some really cool stuff there. I've looked at the S&P Global Ratings. I think they've got 4 or 5 bits of collateral plus links to more stuff. And as we've heard from them today, there's lots of information available. And if you've got a problem with them, it's going to be down to you, because it sounds like there are plenty of ways which you can communicate. I won't share Beth and Pierre's email addresses or phone numbers, but I'm sure there are people you can communicate at S&P Global Ratings. Do fill in the survey at the end. And thank you again, Beth and Pierre. It's been really interesting. I've learned a lot. Hopefully we've achieved a bit of shedding a bit of light into this rating methodology that is so important. Sounds like you folks are doing some really good work there, and yeah, keep going. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Naresh.
Thank you. Bye.